They could hold a longer spear than a knight in armor could, and they could destroy both horse and armor if they worked together as a team. Also, they learned that when they're firing their guns, they decided they could fire, the book says, in salvo. In other words, in which all the rows of infantry tried at once. And before this, the front row would fire, then it would like step back a couple paces and reload. The second row would step up and it would fire, and then they'd step back. But then they decided they'd fire, every row would fire all at once. And this meant that when they fired, the enemy would get a big volley. Now, in those days, they couldn't fire, I mean, when I say all at once, that was their intent, to fire all at once. But actually, the rifles did not all go off at once. So if you had been there, instead of hearing like one big clap of all the rifles firing at once like you might hear today, instead the rifles would fire, I say one at a time, but their intent was to fire all at once. Again, they were not as well built as today's rifles are. But, again, this called for training and discipline, organization that you had not seen among soldiers before. Ships also got bigger and bigger, and the weapons on them also got bigger and bigger. All right, which takes us up to absolutism. The best example of absolutism is the reign of Louis XIV. Essentially, the word absolutism means for the first time in European history, well, not the first time, but they had the concept of divine right monarchy. Where the monarch received his power from God, and he was expected to be obeyed. In other words, the king's word was law. He was the government of the country. He decided how much the taxes should be. He decided what laws were enforced and what laws were not. Louis XIV got the throne as a boy of 4, and eventually, like other kings, at the age of 18, he told his advisors, who were more or less his regents, he said, "I'm now in charge." And he said that every law on every level had to be signed by him. In other words, don't anybody on any level of government make a law without me. If you want a law obeyed, run it through my office. And he would even sign laws. The first thing he did when he got up was sign laws. Then he would eat breakfast. He even signed bills into law while he was eating breakfast. And when he took a bath, he would also sign bills from his bathtub. And I must say this about taking a bath. He told one person one time, he said, "I believe, I'm not sure, but I think I take a bath about once a year." I'll leave it up to you to decide. Europeans generally do not take baths as often as Americans do. Now Napoleon, he was different. Napoleon took a bath every day. And Napoleon signed away the Louisiana Purchase from his bathtub. Signed to the territory, the Louisiana Territory of the United States. Louis XIV, again, said he only took a bath about once a year, which was not uncommon even for kings at that time.
Question.
Yes?
You're saying 14th,
Louis, yeah, thank you. Louis XIV, all right, I'm glad somebody's alert. Yeah, XIV. Now, I want to say about Louis XIV. He engaged in 5 wars, and one of his wars was to try to conquer Holland for the Catholic Church. He couldn't. Actually, when he invaded Holland, the Prince of Holland opened up the dikes and flooded the region of Amsterdam. And if you know anything about Holland, Holland is mostly under the level of the ocean, and even in the 1600s they were using dikes to hold back the water. Well, they opened up the dikes so that Louis's army could not march into Amsterdam. Well, Louis said, "I know what I'll do. Come winter time, when it's frozen over solid, I'll march my men on the ice." That year they had the mildest weather on record. And again, what they didn't know at the time, you know, Holland has mild weather anyway, because Holland gets its warmth from the Gulf Stream, from the Gulf of Mexico. The warm waters of the Gulf do not just dissipate, they form a stream that crosses all the way to the Atlantic and comes out in the North Sea right there in Holland, and warm wind. But in the case of that particular winter, it was a warmer winter than usual, and the water never froze. And come spring, Louis had to abandon the siege. It was becoming expensive. He realized, I can't conquer these people because I can't get my men across the, well, basically across the ocean water. So he gave up the siege and went home. His wars cost France a lot of money. In addition, he built the magnificent palace at Versailles. The palace still stands. But the palace was magnificent, and other European monarchs were jealous, said, hey, let's try to keep up V-E-R-S-A-I. They would build a magnificent palace, and there came a saying, let's keep up with the Bourbons. V-E-R-S-A-I-L-L-E-S. Yeah, okay, I believe that's spelled rightly now. Now, make a long story short, folks, I'm going to I've had a student criticize or jumping ahead, but I think it's important to know where this all leads. Louis XIV became an old man, and he realized he was on his deathbed. He had outlived his son, outlived his grandson, so the next heir apparent was his great-grandson. Actually, his second, he outlived his first great-grandson. This was during a time when a lot of people didn't live long. So they called in his second great-grandson, who was to become Louis XV. This boy was only 5 years old. So this old man, lying on his deathbed, says to his great-grandson, my son, I'm leaving, and it pains me to leave my people in the condition I'm leaving them in. They're in poverty, deep poverty. I told myself all my life that I would eventually end the tax. That once I got all I wanted, I would eventually end the tax, but I never did. I never did have all I wanted. My son, don't be as I have been. Don't do as I have done. He died shortly thereafter. Louis XV got the throne as a boy of 5. Louis XV grew up and became even more extravagant than Louis XIV had been. France went 130 years under 2 kings, Louis XIV and Louis XV, both of them who had gotten the throne as little boys, and both of them who lived to be old men. What happened when Louis XVI came on the throne? Louis XVI wound up having his head chopped off. Again, a lot of it could be traced. Louis XVI was far more innocent than Louis XIV and Louis XV had been, but Louis XVI got the blame for most of the problems that France had. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Yeah, your book shows a picture of the Palace of Versailles, the Hall of Mirrors. It's extremely magnificent, and it was paid for at the expense of the French taxpayer. All right, who were the French taxpayers? The nobility and clergy didn't pay any taxes. The poor people paid all the taxes that built the magnificent palace. And the poor people got really, really poor. All right. In the case of Prussia, you won't find Prussia on a map. It's today Germany. Your book shows on the map on a few pages back where it was located. The map is on page 438. Prussia was located, it looks very small, there next to Poland, not far from Warsaw. But Prussia, where Prussia is important is eventually when Germany united in 1870, united under the leadership of the Prussian monarch. Prussia became the most powerful state in Germany. And one of the reasons was that Frederick, there's 2 Fredericks. The Frederick who was just at first the elector. That means he picked the Holy Roman Emperor. Then the next one became king. These 2 men built up the Prussian army and built up a civilian bureaucracy to support that army and made the Prussian army the most well-trained and the best equipped army in Europe. They always were upgrading the rifles. The rifles were the best make known, and they were always changing for their artillery for the better. They'd sell the old to other countries that weren't as particular, and they only used the best. And this was to remain true to Germany up until the end of World War II. Germany prided itself on having a huge army. To the south of Germany lay Austria. Austria looks on a map like a big country, but unlike Prussia, Austria remained primitive. Its weaponry was always behind. Its economics was always tending to be behind. And they had a difficult time staying together. Austria was not a very united country. They had all mixture of several languages and several ethnic groups, and their emperor tried to keep them together. Eventually, the nation of Austria was to break up after World War I into several smaller countries, including Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and a whole bunch of smaller countries. That's where this is heading. Russia, and then I'll quit for the day. Ivan IV was the first Russian to use the title of Tsar. The Russian kings called themselves, sometimes that word is spelled like this, C-Z-A-R or T-S-A-R. The word is a Russian translation for Caesar, because the Russian monarch said, I married the last Caesar's daughter, therefore I'm Caesar. When the last Caesar was Constantine X of the Byzantine Empire. He had married the Byzantine Empire's daughter, and he said, therefore I'm the heir to the title, since there's no longer any Caesars in the Byzantine Empire. The only man whose name I want you to remember here is the name of Peter the Great. Peter the Great believed that Russia's destiny lay to the west. Now again, if you look on the map, you'll find that Russia is somewhat between east and west. And the Russians were tending to think, well, are we really eastern or are we western? Peter the Great said, I want you to become western. And he forced the Russian people to adopt western manners, to adopt western dress, to get rid of their long beards, and get rid of the gowns, and said start dressing in. The long beards were necessary to keep out the cold Russian winter, and the long gowns were necessary for the same purpose. But Peter said, never mind what is necessary to keep out the bad weather. We're going to make you people into Westerners. And whether he wanted to or not, every Russian man was expected to learn how to smoke. And again, this is because the Westerners were doing it. And it sounds kind of crazy, but the idea was he wanted to westernize and bring them up. And this started a trend that we're going to see in Russian history from that day to this, where that Russia is behind the West and trying to catch up. Behind and trying to catch up. And during most of my lifetime, the Russians have been just that, behind and trying to catch up. And yes, Russia is making big news even at this moment. They're being beset by a possible terrorist attack, similar to the United States. But unlike other countries, their police will not cooperate with Western police to try to combat the terrorists. And the result is Americans are being advised, don't go to the Winter Olympics. It might be dangerous there. Again, all this has its roots back in the time period we're talking about.